In July last year, a China Labor Watch report on an IT factory of 3,000 workers showed that its workers were doing 136 hours or more of overtime per month. The clients of these three factories listed here included Dell, HP, Apple, Sony, Microsoft, Asus, Nokia, and Panasonic, and Samsung. In 2012, I personally went as part of a China Labor Watch investigation to Dongguan in southern China, to a factory that's producing cell phones for Samsung. This factory has 5,000 workers. I remember speaking to a young woman personally at that factory who's on the night shift, and she told me that she works for 15 hours per day, with only 1 day of rest per month. Through further investigation, China Labor Watch discovered that the workers at the Samsung supplier factory were doing 220 hours or more of overtime per month. This is over 6 times the legal limit. This averages out to about 7 hours of overtime per day. Despite such long hours, workers at this factory were earning less than the local average wage. And as if being forced to work illegally excessive working hours wasn't enough, many electronics workers do not even get paid for all of their work. In IT factories, workers are made to meet up to 20 minutes before their shift and up to 30 minutes after their shift in unpaid work meetings. It's very rare that this overtime is calculated into the wages of IT workers. And needless to say, requiring employees to work without paying them is illegal. Most recently, in China Labor Watch's report on a Quanta factory in Shanghai that produces for Apple, Sony, Dell, and HP, we found that with 60,000 workers, this factory was, with estimated numbers, was failing to pay workers at least $1.8 million in unpaid overtime every month. This is about 6% of those workers' wages. Such unpaid overtime is widespread in Chinese IT factories. Every month, millions and millions of dollars go unpaid to Chinese workers. Hiring discrimination is also rampant in these factories. Due to the high intensity of work in IT factories, these factories and their cooperating hiring agencies will usually restrict what age the workers can be if they want to work in the factory. It's usually under 30 years old. Factories also regularly refuse to hire workers that are too short. Men with long hair, people with dyed hair, applicants of certain ethnicities or from certain regions in China, pregnant women, and people with tattoos. These discriminatory hiring practices are in violation of both international and Chinese labor law. Even if workers manage to get hired at an IT factory, they usually have to pay hundreds of renminbi in fees to get hired through hiring agencies. And these fees are illegal in China. Factories cooperate with these hiring agencies, or so-called labor dispatch companies, in order to avoid the tremendous task of hiring thousands or tens of thousands of workers in a short amount of time. Many workers sign contracts directly with the labor dispatch companies instead of with the factories. This makes it easier for the factories to get rid of the workers if they become a problem, and not take responsibility for them or give them compensation if they get injured. Between 50 and 90% of the workforce of most IT factories in China are composed of dispatch workers. Due to the tremendous abuse of dispatch workers, as of March 1st, that's 2 weeks from now, March 1st this year, the Chinese government will restrict each employer to hiring no more than 10% dispatch workers. This means that as of March 1st, many, if not most, IT factories in China will be violating the law. Child labor is still a problem in these IT factories in China. In 2012 and 2013, China Labor Watch discovered child workers that were producing for Samsung, Apple, Asus, among others. As mentioned before, 2 of these children died of what could have been exhaustion. Child workers usually enter the IT factories through hiring agencies. These agencies will provide child workers with fake IDs and other documents for a fee. The factories, who are usually desperate to hire large amounts of workers, fail to properly run background checks to prevent the child workers from entering the factory. Just got to check the time. I'm rushed on time here. A related problem is that of student workers. Especially during the summer, IT factories may hire thousands of student workers for so-called internships. These workers, who are often under 18 years old, are brought to the factories as a requirement for graduation. If they do not go to the factories, they will not graduate. They have no choice in the matter. They'll go for 3 to 6 months and often earn less money than a normal worker despite doing the same work in the same long hours. Many schools in this situation will receive kickbacks for bringing a certain amount of students to the factory. And then there's still safety issues in these factories that are often in violation of laws. Despite looking clean, IT factories are full of safety hazards, including chemicals, dust, paints, and heavy machinery. Chinese law requires that factories provide no less than 24 hours of training to workers before they go on the job. Yet in most IT factories, workers receive far less than 24 hours. For example, in the Quanta factory that I spoke about before that produces for Apple, Sony, Dell, and HP, workers are trained for 6 hours on the first day before going to work on the second day. Of that 6 hours, only 10 minutes involve safety. Additionally, some factories lack proper fire prevention equipment and escape routes. And factories almost never let workers participate in fire drills that will prepare them of knowledge of what to do in case of a large fire or explosion. Finally, after long, tiring, and sometimes dangerous days of work, workers at IT factories don't really have much to look forward to when they go back to the factory-provided dormitories. Most dorm rooms in these factories have between 8 and 12 people to a room. The rooms are little more than a concrete floor, metal bed frames, a window, and maybe a fan. Even in the hot southern climate where temperatures can reach 40 degrees Celsius, dorm rooms sometimes don't even have air conditioning. This one does, but many don't. Hundreds of workers on each dorm floor usually share one bathroom with just a handful of toilets and showers, and there's usually no hot water in these dorms. This is how Chinese electronics workers live. These legal and ethical violations are just a few of the long list of violations that have been exposed in Chinese IT factories in the past few years. I'm not going to continue to go into detail because I don't have enough time to do it, but I'm going to list a few more, and they're also listed here. Workers are made to sign blank contracts. They have difficulty resigning from the factory. Their work is overly intense. They're verbally and physically abused by management. They're sometimes given worker fines for certain behaviors, and they have to stand while working for 12 hours a day. Widespread labor abuse in Chinese IT factories has a number of underlying causes that I'm going to talk quickly about. The first is related to China's political system. The main performance measures for local officials is economic development, not the satisfaction of local residents. So if I'm the mayor of a large industrial city on China's coast, my main goal is to keep the economy growing at a fast clip. But if I'm too strict about the enforcement of labor laws, it may cause big tax-paying companies to move their operations to another region. This has led to lax application of labor law and favoring of interest of business over labor during disputes. For example, even when a group of workers brings a joint lawsuit or complaint against a company, the government will often require these workers to enter legal procedures individually. This is more costly for workers and causes many workers to just give up on the legal process. In addition to the weakness of law enforcement and legal processes, Chinese workers do not have the right to independent unionization. All unions in China are controlled by one government-run federation of unions. Additionally, at the factory level, the leader of a union, if there is a union at the factory, is a part of the management of that company. This makes the union ineffective during times of labor management dispute. Moreover, it is illegal for workers to organize strikes or collective action outside of the union. Despite this, workers sometimes do strike in China. Yet the strikes are usually suppressed quickly by local officials. And even if the strikes succeed in initiating collective negotiations, the strike leaders are often fired by the factories or later harassed by authorities. Under such political circumstances, IT brand companies that are supplied by these Chinese factories have largely been left to regulate themselves. Brand companies have made some efforts to monitor their supply chains through social auditing. But as has been proven in reports by NGOs and news organizations, social auditing has fallen victim to all sorts of pitfalls. For example, in a 2013 investigative report, the New York Times took social auditing to task for being superficial, rushed, and flawed. Given these problems, when an auditing organization certifies a factory as being socially ethical, it is rarely a guarantee that this factory does not have major legal and ethical violations. Let me note, every one of the dozens of IT factories of which China Labor Watch has discovered serious labor abuse was audited or certified by an auditing organization before China Labor Watch carried out the investigation. Yet even when brand companies know about safety or rights violations in their supply chains, the measures they take to remedy these violations often fall short of fundamental change. This is because fundamental change would require the rethinking of buying practices, like the lead time on product orders and the prices for those orders. But these reforms are in conflict with the core business interests of profit maximization. And in China, where government entities are not effectively checking business interests, profit maximization is crushing the respect for human rights. But the Chinese government is not the only party responsible for the enforcement of labor rights in Chinese IT factories. Consumption countries also have a responsibility to rein in on the behavior of corporations abroad. This duty is explained in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The guiding principles were endorsed in the UN by Germany in 2011, along with practically every other Western European country. It is the duty of governments of consumption countries to act. This includes European governments and European public procurers. So under China's political environment, how do we increase transparency and strengthen respect for labor rights? There have been efforts by various groups to create innovative solutions. For example, since 2010, China Labor Watch has operated a worker hotline in China. The hotline cooperates with about 110 factories that produce for 2 multinational brand companies. When workers call the hotline with a complaint, the hotline staff will verify information with the factory. When needed, the staff will contact the brand company to put pressure on the factory to rectify violations. In less than 4 years, this hotline has handled about 4,300 cases related to wage delays, working hours, safety, benefits, contracts, and more. The far majority of these cases are handled to the satisfaction of workers involved. So even on a small scale, with a promotion in only 110 factories, CLW's hotline has been able to help thousands of workers. There is also a new initiative called Electronics Watch, which seeks to coordinate the tremendous leverage of European public buyers in order to improve working conditions of electronic workers, especially IT workers in China, where the majority of IT hardware is manufactured. Electronics Watch will provide independent monitoring and reform plans to public procurers that participate in this initiative. Reform will include measures like the reform of brand buying practices, worker training, and the establishment of worker hotlines in IT factories. Later presentations in this conference, including a presentation in particular on Electronics Watch tomorrow, will include more detail about this program. China Labor Watch sincerely hopes that public buyers will recognize the urgency of reforming IT hardware supply chains. Germany in particular is a country with a proud labor tradition. And I have hope that my illustrations here today have helped you understand the tremendous and tragic costs that are being borne by tens of millions of electronics workers. Thank you.